We would now like to invite Professor Patrice Geoffroy of the Le Cercle d'Économistes, Mr. Benedict Chia, Director of the Strategic Issues of the National Climate Change Secretariat of Singapore, Ms. Jean Stump, Head of Asia Sustainable Finance, Global Finance Practice of the WWF Singapore Leadership Team, and Mr. Matthew Girardin, Chief Executive Officer of CMA CGM, on stage for the next session on the challenge of addressing climate change. Panelists, please.
Thank you. I'm Patrice Geoffroy, Professor of Economics in Paris Dauphine University and member of the Cercle des Économistes. I will not say that I'm happy to chair that panel of climate change. It would sound strange, but I think we will have in front of us 1 hour of discussion, very important discussion, if we consider especially that in any session since the beginning of that forum yesterday, climate change have been mentioned. So we have 1 hour to both discuss between and address that challenge between all of us and have a discussion with the auditorium. First of all, I will make 2 remarks. So we are supposed to discuss the challenge of climate change. First of all, maybe we need to define what it means from an economic point of view to address that challenge. Since we don't have the possibility to diffuse slide, I will invite you to make an effort and to imagine the following chart. In 1950, the world was emitting around 10,000 gigatons, 10 gigatons of CO2, and now we are somewhere around 40 gigatons. According to the Paris Agreement, with the objective to limit the growth of the temperature at the end of that century between 1.5 and 2 degrees, we need to decrease, to lower that CO2 emission between now and the middle of that century from 40 to 5 or 10. Meaning that in 2050, the challenge is to be able to emit as much CO2 compared than what was the level of emission 1 century ago. But between that 2 point of the time, between that period, the world GDP will have been multiplied by 10 and the world population will have been multiplied by 3 or 4. Okay, so this is a challenge and we cannot postpone that effort, and roughly what is supposed to occur with the Paris Agreement is the beginning of that inversion of the CO2 emission in a few years. And the later we will do that, the more difficult and challenging will be that fighting and finding a sustainable solution against climate change. And then if we consider, for example, what has been discussed this morning regarding disruption, regarding world leadership and so, mechanically that transformation of the world will have an impact, will require disruption from a technological point of view, and will have an impact in terms of global leadership. And to be clear with you, we don't have any clear idea as regard the way the world will be redefined, because we don't have any clear idea of what it means from an economic point of view to create economic value in emitting less and less CO2, because behind us we have more than 2 centuries of GDP creation with more and more CO2. And that new macroeconomic model, or if we consider that at the level of corporation, that new business model is something that is completely terra incognita. And this is a challenge to understand what it will mean to change that world. The second remark that I would like to make, and it is not only to be polite, is that it makes sense to have that kind of discussion in Singapore. For a few reasons. First of all, if we want to address global externality and global issue, we need to discuss between human beings from different nationality. But in the case of Singapore, there is specific interest because once again, if we consider what was the world in the middle of the last century, there was let's say, 3 billion people, and half of them were living in cities. In the middle of the present century, we will be 9, maybe 10 billion people, and according to the United Nations, 50% of that population will live in cities. And then I don't know, once again, if we will succeed to fight the climate change and to succeed to implement the Paris Agreement, but to be able to do that means being able to live in compact, complex cities and to organize the life inside of that cities. And from that point of view, what we can observe in a state city like Singapore is interesting as regards the challenge to integrate that complexity on one side, but on the other side, and we had yesterday evening a very interesting, moreover very fascinating visit of the port. We observe also what is the economic model of Singapore and the way Singapore depends on the globalization as it is organized today, and in fact the way it depends on the historical model in which we create economic value in emitting more and more CO2. This is what we will discuss between now and 1 p.m. And for that we have a very diverse panel with the representation of a public institution, with the representation of an NGO, and with the representation of an industrial corporation. And first of all, I will leave the floor to Mr. Benedict Chia, who is Director for Strategic Issues at the National Climate Change Secretariat of Singapore. Benedict, please.
Thank you so much for having us here and for organizing this session on climate change, which is increasingly an issue of importance amongst many thought leaders around the world. Recently, the World Meteorological Organization has actually released data that showed that actually the last 4 years has been the warmest years on record. In Singapore, when we look at our own data, we find that actually the last decade has been the warmest decade on record. This really reflects the fact that global emissions have been going up. Global temperatures have also been going up. Around the world, we have seen global temperatures increase on average since the pre-industrial period by 1 degree Celsius. If we look at the Paris Agreement, we look at the pledges that countries have put on the table, we are on track towards a 3-degree world, 3.0 to 3.2 degree world. This really assumes that countries implement whatever they say they will implement. Last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a UN body of scientists and scientific advisors, actually released this 1.5 degree report. And the 1.5 degree report essentially states that the impact, both on the economy, both on the physical world of 2 degrees is significantly more than 1.5 degrees. And then underlying the importance of 1.5 degree, they've actually stated that if you want to keep within 1.5 degrees, essentially what this means is that everybody, the whole world, by 2050 needs to be net carbon zero or carbon neutral. It's very, very challenging because I think, as was mentioned, it really means a fairly fundamental shift from our current business as usual practices. If you look at the impact, we have already had a 1 degree Celsius increase. And with a 1 degree Celsius increase, the Bank of England has found that over the last 30 years, the physical impact of climate change in the form of extreme weather has caused billions of dollars worth of damages. In fact, the annual damage has increased by 3 times over the last 30 years. Studies have also shown that property devaluation has also occurred, especially for assets which are near coastal areas and which are affected by the physical impacts of climate change. Going forward, will this get worse? Most of the scientists seem to have concluded that probably because a lot of the IPCC findings do not incorporate everything out there. It's essentially consensus-based, based on whatever scientists can currently agree on right now. There's ongoing work to look at things like ice sheet melting, which has not been fully incorporated into current IPCC numbers. And going forward, the expectation is that the numbers are likely to get worse. I think most countries around the world recognize that climate change is happening. And in recognition of that, I think as mentioned, we had the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, if you look at it internationally, was one of the fastest international agreements to be ratified in slightly under a year. Number of people have criticized the Paris Agreement in the sense that it's a very bottom-up agreement where each country can voluntarily state whatever it wants. So criticism has been it's not a strong agreement, which is why we're on a 3-degree pathway. But if you delve deeper into the Paris Agreement, I think there are 3 features which we would take a bit of joy from. The first is the Paris Agreement brings about greater transparency. It puts in place a framework where every 2 years, countries need to report on their carbon emissions. It needs to report on the action that it's taking to address climate change. And this reporting requirements is fairly evenly spread out between developing and developed countries. The developed countries do have a bit more time to catch up, but eventually the lines are blurring. It's a major distinction because the previous agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, makes a very sharp distinction between the developed world and the developing world. A lot more onerous commitments on the developed economies, and the developing economies, most of it is voluntary. So I think this is a fairly major shift that is within the Paris Agreement. The other key feature within the Paris Agreement is what we call a 5-year review cycle. It has put in place a 5-year review cycle. And the 5-year review cycle actually requires countries to update or to improve whatever pledges they put on the table. And improvements can take many different forms. In the simplest form, it can take a description of what exactly you're going to do to hit your target. It can also take an expansion of your target, because not all countries' targets cover all gases or sectors. So that's another scope. Or it can even take increase in ambition. And I think over time, if we were to realize the Paris goals of 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, really countries around the world do need to step up effort as we progress through each 5-year cycle. The other key feature of the Paris Agreement is to really put forward a long-term emission strategy, 2050 emission strategy. And we have seen a number of countries doing that. We expect more to actually put forward such targets on the table. Most of these targets are fairly ambitious, 70–80% below historical levels or carbon neutrality. So in sum, I would say that the Paris Agreement is actually a major piece of international agreement framework that has been agreed on. There has been progress, perhaps not as fast as what we require to be able to keep within the goals in which it's set out, but progress is surely there. And I think over time we are heartened by the fact that we expect momentum to continue. The US has been a topic that has been talked about quite regularly. Trump pulling out of the Paris Agreement, and many people have actually asked, does this mean that the world is going on a completely different path? But if you delve further and you look at it further, US emissions have generally been going down. Last year it went up slightly, but the projections from which the US government agencies have put forward is that over time it is still expected to go down. It's a little bit open right now as to whether the US will meet its emissions target or not. But if you delve deeper and you look at it, the reality in the US is that a lot of emissions reduction is really driven by the fact that renewable energy is becoming cheaper in the US, even compared to shale gas. You look at solar, you look at wind, especially in the States where there are abundant solar and wind resources. It's a very, very cost-competitive source of electricity. This has actually helped the switch. The other reason is because the US has moved away from coal towards shale gas, which is abundant of. In a sense, that we still see momentum on that front. Other countries, Europe, China, some of the larger economies, Japan, Australia. Again, if you delve deeper and you look at what's driving some of emissions reduction, a lot of it is really driven by the fact that renewables is getting cheaper, and emissions reduction is becoming more economically beneficial. It is not something that you do at huge cost. In fact, it's something that you do where there are economic benefits. I think the other reason why we see improvements is really addressing climate change is becoming more than just something that government should do. A lot of companies are also getting onto the act. A lot of cities are also getting onto the act. So if you look at the city levels, their movement amongst a growing number of cities, both developing and developed countries, developed cities, to talk about carbon neutrality. At the company level, there are initiatives such as Renewable Energy 100, RE100, which is a list of companies which commit to power all their operations through renewable energies. The other key initiative is the Science Based Target Initiative, which are companies that put forth ambitious climate change targets, which are aligned with the Paris goals. So I think in sum, though there have been some setbacks, though movement is not as fast as we think it'd be, I would be a little bit more optimistic because the economics of addressing climate change seems to have been improving over time, and we are getting a lot more players on board, such as companies and cities beyond countries that are also taking ambitious action. Thank you.
If I may, could you share with us some key element of the strategy in Singapore, both as regard CO2 mitigation, but as regard also adaptation? Because even if all of us don't live in Singapore, we know that water is all over Singapore, and then the evolution in the future of the sea level is probably a key issue in Singapore.
In Singapore itself, our emissions target for 2030 is a 36% emissions intensity improvement. But we have pledged to peak our emissions, to work towards peaking at around 2030. And essentially peaking means after 2030, emissions will have to stabilize and decline thereafter. What we are doing in Singapore, we have really taken early action. So we have moved away from fuel oil as a source of power generation to natural gas. Natural gas generation is about 96, 97%, which is a cleaner form of fossil fuel. But we don't disagree, it is still carbon. There's still carbon content in it. So on that front, we're doing two things. We're trying to move towards more efficient natural gas generation technologies. We are also moving towards how we can further increase renewable deployment in Singapore. So currently, right now, we have got about 180, 190 megawatts peak of solar. We are hoping to hit 350 in 2020 or 2021, and thereafter, hopefully not too long, we're looking at 1 gigawatt peak. So it's a fairly large increase in power generation. And as far as possible, going forward, we are studying how far can we stretch this target. Can we increase the deployment of renewables further in Singapore? There needs to be adjustments within our energy system, our electricity grid itself. So that's for power. Industry itself, our energy efficiency improvement rate has been slowly creeping up. Still below leading countries around the world, which is 1 to 2% annual improvement in energy efficiency. I think we were at 0.5, we creeped up to 0.8, 0.9, but we have stated publicly that we are looking at 1 to 2%. And really to support this is really the implementation of a carbon tax, which actually took place this year. We are starting off at a transitional rate of $5, but we have said that by 2030, we are looking at a rate of $10 to $15. And our carbon tax does not include any exemptions. On the building sector, we are moving towards, we are increasing our share of green buildings, I think about from 38% to 80% green building share by 2030. And in doing this, we are looking at positive energy low-rise, so a low-rise building that generates more energy than it consumes, zero energy medium-rise, as well as super low energy buildings. So this is part of one of the latest green building master plans which our Building and Construction Authority has rolled out. And finally, in the transport sector, we are moving towards, the bigger shift is really moving towards greater public modal share, as well as seeing how we can encourage, we are doing test bits on electric vehicles with the view of scaling up over time. Yeah. So those are the big measures which we are doing on emissions reduction. On adaptation, how we responding to the impact of climate change itself, a lot of work is still ongoing, but one of the key things that we have set in place is that reclamation and redevelopment level. So when new projects are being redeveloped, they need to be redeveloped up to a minimum of 4 meters above mean sea level. For key projects such as Changi Airport or Terminal 5, we are building up to 5.5 meters above sea level. So this is something that, these are key things that we need to do as new projects come online. But the broader issue, how exactly we are dealing with it, a lot of work is ongoing, but it's a major challenge that we see Singapore needing to have to address. We are also looking at broader impacts of climate change in terms of vector-borne diseases. So we are trying to understand how we can address rise in mosquito-borne diseases with higher temperatures. We're also looking at food security as well. So recently it was announced that we are aiming for 30% self-produced food by 2030.
Thank you, Benedict. Jan Stamp, you are the head of Asia Sustainable Finance for the WWF, and your position is particularly relevant to explain to us how finance could present a leverage as to invent that new growth model.
Sure. Good afternoon, distinguished guests. As mentioned, I will be looking at the powerful role that the finance sector can play. In Southeast Asia, where we are located now, it's particularly vulnerable to climate change. So, in addition to extreme weather events, sea level rise, chronic heat stress, we will see food and water insecurity. Benedict touched upon some of that. And the climate-related negative impacts will result in annual economic losses of 6.7% of the ASEAN region's GDP by 2100, which is far higher than the global average of 2.6%. And, as mentioned earlier as well, despite signing up to the Paris Agreement, the NDCs of most ASEAN countries are not aligned to 2 degrees due to the often mentioned reason of needing to electrify their countries quickly or lack of funding, which means that non-state players must and can drive change, especially the finance sector. And the finance sector has a breakthrough now. It no longer has to depend solely on corporate or government disclosure, which is a problem, especially in Asia. So WWF's Asia Sustainable Finance Initiative has a slew of knowledge partners, including Oxford University's Smith School of Sustainable Finance, which is also a member of the UK government's Green Finance Task Force. They were in town this week presenting their recent study of the Southeast Asian power sector to financiers. And the study uses a powerful tool that maps the life of assets and the technologies used, so you get a stock and the flows, and showed that 88% of ASEAN's current fossil fuel generation assets are incompatible with 1.5 degrees, and 56% of the planned assets are incompatible. Even if we raise the bar to 2 degrees, 46.5% of these assets are incompatible. So if the governments lack ambition to scale up clean energy to shift away from coal, the financiers can pull away from financing new 30 to 40-year assets that will bust the carbon budget and lobby governments to create transparent bidding processes and power purchase agreements that take into account the unique profile of renewable energy assets that have a higher upfront cost and lower running costs. And it's not just the power sector where the financiers have tools now to effect climate alignment. The newest tool, PECTA, which is created by another SV partner, 2 degrees, and it was done in collaboration with WWF, University of Zurich, University of Frankfurt, covers 8 sectors: power, coal mining, oil and gas, automotive, cement, steel, aviation, and shipping. You will hear about shipping later. This is a forward-looking analysis that takes into account the existing assets on the ground, capacity additions and production forecasts, as well as CapEx plans. The typical backward-looking carbon footprint analysis, what emissions did we have last year, that's provided by companies or third-party data providers, is ineffective. The PECTA tool enables investors to proactively engage with portfolio companies to align their CapEx plans towards the right technologies and production assets needed to stay well under 2 degrees and to redefine their business models to fit a new low-carbon sustainable economy. So the tool has been used by over 600 investors as part of a partnership with the Principles for Responsible Investment, which has over 2,000 signatories representing over $80 trillion assets under management, as well as some progressive supervisory authorities such as the California Department of Insurance, the Swiss Ministry of Environment, the Central Bank of the Netherlands, and the Bank of England. Now, when we talk about climate change and mitigation, most of the attention tends to fall on the energy and transport sectors. But AFALU, which is agriculture, forestry, and land use change, that accounts for just under 25% of man-made GHG emissions. And this number is higher in Southeast Asia. If you look at palm oil, which is a ubiquitous product, as a key example, 40% of palm oil is from smallholders whose yields are not even half of the best plantations. There is a lot of room to grow food through yield rather than by deforestation-related expansion. Yet there has been and continues to be massive deforestation. The European Commission recently concluded that 45% of the expansion of palm oil production since 2008 led to severe deforestation and will phase out its use in transport biofuels. So unfortunately, there are weak regulations and poor enforcement in some countries, and there's promotion of weak standards for sustainable palm oil. And some governments and regional banks and investors are too slow to move on deforestation. I mean, fortunately, there are a few leading lights. You see CalPERS, the $200 billion asset owner in the US. You see the Norwegian Pension Fund, including no deforestation criteria in their responsible investment policy. And those who are not moving are facing scrutiny. So recently, 9 US senators, including the 2020 presidential candidates Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, recently challenged major investors such as BlackRock and JP Morgan to tackle deforestation in their palm oil investments. And in March, 3 large Dutch investors, Robeco, NM, and Actiam, reaffirmed their commitments to engage along the palm oil supply chains and highlighted the need for clearly outlined expectations to drive sustainability in the sector. And there are tools available to help financiers. WWF has a site tool. Our partner WRI has Global Forest Watch, where financiers can run an overlap analysis of key biodiversity areas, World Heritage sites, with companies in multiple industries, not just agriculture, but also oil and gas, infrastructure, mining, which are other key drivers of deforestation. In fact, in ASEAN, 30% of oil and gas and mining concessions overlap with intact tropical forest landscapes. So a huge source of GHG emissions can be eradicated if regional financiers step up to link the cost of and access of capital to no deforestation criteria. And now proper assessment of risk is a great step forward, but the next is decarbonize in line with 2 degrees. WWF, alongside WRI and CDP, developed the science-based targets to help companies set appropriate decarbonization targets. So that covers energy supply chains, manufacturing, transport, buildings, and also AFLU. Now, 515 companies, of which 126 sit in Asia, have signed up. Out of the 126, over half are from Japan, 3 are in Singapore. So this is a clear demonstration of the role of private sector leadership. And investors have also put their weight behind this. Climate Action 100 brings together 320 investors with $33 trillion AUM to engage with the highest carbon-emitting companies. And a recent win includes Shell finally agreeing to set short-term targets. Long-term targets are fine, but in the short term, tends to be BAU. Right, business as usual. So, and link CEO pay and also publish annual progress updates and report against the TCFD. And pilot testing for science-based targets for financial institutions is about to begin to allow financial institutions to set science-based targets for different asset classes, from listed equity to corporate bonds and loans to real estate. And 36 financial institutions, including Société Générale, BNP, AXA, have made public commitments to implement these. So it's key that the laggard financial institutions take steps so that they do not create a secondary financing market for unsustainable companies exacerbating climate change. And doing this with stakeholders such as the knowledge partners of the Asia Sustainable Finance Initiative will ensure that science-based criteria and methods are used rather than empty processes, and it creates legitimacy and transparency and, most importantly, effective change. And financiers want governments to also step up and demonstrate leadership and not frustrate their efforts. We see 288 investors representing $26 trillion AUM writing to government leaders, urging them to implement the necessary actions to achieve Paris. So to update and strengthen the NDCs, to align all of their climate-related policy frameworks with the Paris Agreement, to put a meaningful price on carbon, to phase out fossil fuel subsidies and thermal coal power, and to publicly support and commit to implement the TCFD recommendations. So if we all play our part, government, private sector, civil society, academia, and demonstrate leadership, we have a chance to tackle the greatest crisis facing humanity, as David Attenborough recently called it. If not, we'll be the frog in the boiler. So, thanks.
Thank you, Jane. I share your view that finance will represent a leverage in that transition between that 2 worlds that I was trying to depict at the very beginning of our conversation. And I belong to a university which is specialized in finance, and we believe and we teach to our students that finance will be a leverage. But My perception is that where we are at the end of that decade, there is a kind of paradox, because on one side, the commitment of many institutions is more and more obvious. But on the other side, if we observe the growth of CO2 emission after 3 years of stabilization between 2013 to 2016, we have still a growth during the 2 last years and probably during the present years. And how do you explain, if you can, that paradox between, on one side, that commitment which is for some institution quite spectacular and obviously really new, and that evolution of the reality of the CO2 emission, which at the end of the day, it what will count?
Sure. I mean, if we look at the companies and the science-based targets, many are just having set these targets, right? So it's new from that point of view. For the SBT for financial institutions, the methodology is being finalized now with the pilot test. So I would say that, some of the earlier commitments, we see many companies stating they're going to set targets, but the question is, are the targets 2 degrees, 1.5, or are they 4 degrees, 3 degrees? Or many companies doing scenario analysis and saying, absolutely fine, we are fully in line, or they set 30-year targets. So which is exactly why the investors went after Shell to say that, I don't know what you're doing, right? And you need to be more transparent. What are you doing in the next 3 years, in the next 5 years? So again, that's where science comes in, and that, WWF, we are not civil society like a campaigning NGO. We're actually a science-based conservation organizations with scientists in multiple fields, and we work closely with academics as well, where you inject the science, because at the end of the day, environment, planetary boundaries, natural capital, those are all defined by science. We can't just set an arbitrary target that I will reduce my water footprint, my carbon footprint. There's so much of that out there, which is why when we are clear in terms of where is the goalpost that will keep our planet and ourselves alive, then we can start to really mobilize people.
Thank you, Jean. Mathieu Girardin, you are the CEO for Asia of CMA CGM, which is an international company, but also a French company which headquarters is based in Marseille, and which is one of the leaders for shipment, and your daily life is to organize the shipment of container. If I summarize very abruptly what you do with your corporation, and we need to understand whether what has been discussed as regard the carbon footprint of the economic activity is massively, marginally present in your sectoral activity.
Thank you, Professor. I will try to give some insight about how the industry and CMA-CGM in particular is tackling the issue of climate change and decarbonization in the shipping industry. I want to start by giving you 2 numbers regarding this shipping industry. First, 90% of the goods transported worldwide are transported by the shipping industry. So it represents, when we talk about globalization, and here in Singapore we see it every day within the second largest port in the world, globalization is first and foremost a goods exchange by the shipping industry. And the second number I want to give you is the pace of growth of container shipping. Container shipping has been doubling in volumes every 10 years over the past 3 decades. So it gives you an idea of what kind of challenge we are facing in terms of increase of carbon and sulfur and other type of emissions. It's very good that we have this opportunity to talk this year, because it's a very important year. It's a transition year between 2018 to 2020. 2020 is the year of a new regulation in our industry. This new regulation, called IMO 2020, has been decided by the International Maritime Organization, IMO in short, in order to reduce the sulfur emission by 85% for the whole world. All the shipping companies, all the ships in the world will have an alternative next year. They will have either to change their motorization or to burn compliant fuels in order to propel their ships. So this is a massive change for our industry. Just one quick word maybe about CMA CGM, Professor, you mentioned we are a French company. We are based in Marseille. Singapore is also a very important place for us. It's one of our busiest ports of activity. It's also the hub of our Asia-Pacific activities. And we have more than 1,000 people working in Singapore out of a company that now weighs 30 billion worldwide after the recent acquisition of CEVA Logistics. CMA CGM is owned by the Saadeh family. Saadeh family is a family that is committed to the protection of environment. It's something that has been consistent over the past 40 years with Jacques Saadeh, who was the founder of our company. Unfortunately, he passed away in June last year. And his son, Rodolphe Saadeh, is now the chairman and CEO of our company, and he has taken the reins of the company back in 2017, and he wants to pursue this commitment. So our company is committed to this protection, and it's not only about saying it, but we also have a track record as a company to prove that our CO2 emissions have been significantly reduced. I'm giving you two numbers. 2005 to 2015, our CO2 emissions per container transported and per kilometer have been reduced by 50%. So this is obviously more than the average industry, and this has been done by some technological innovation that I will deep dive a little bit into. Second number is what we want to do from there. So 2015 to 2025, we have set as a company a new target to reduce the CO2 emission by 25%. And it's a good start because last year, on the sole year 2017, we reduced by 10%. So your question was also about are we conscious and are we taking action? Yes, we are taking action. How do we take action? The first innovation that we make is on the technology. We change first the shape of our ships. We change the bulbs, so at the front of the ship, to invest into new bulbous bulb in order to reduce the consumption. And same at the rear of the ship with the fins. So without getting too technical, we have some new Baker twisted fins on all our ships, which are improving the performance and reducing the consumption of our ships. We have some new motor injection systems, which are improving the performance as well. And a little bit differently, from a software side, we also have some new routing softwares which are helping us to reduce the consumption, optimize the routes, depending on the current, depending on the weather forecast. And we have, especially in Singapore, a fleet center with captains 24/7 in this fleet center who are helping the ships to find the right routes and reduce the consumption at the end of the day. So that's how we have taken action, and we keep going into this technological innovation in order to reduce the consumption. But there is a game changer going on in our industry, and CMA CGM is the leader in this field. It's what we call liquefied natural gas, LNG. Last year, 2 years ago, in 2017, Rodolphe Saadeh decided to order 9 new mega ships that will be the first one to be powered by LNG, 9 new 22,000 TEU container ships. So this is a bold move. We were the first in the industry to do it, and we are proud to play this pioneer role. Why are we proud? Because LNG is yielding huge benefits in terms of reduction of CO2 compared to heavy fuel oil, which is the oil we are using right now. CO2 is minus 25%. If you think about sulfur emission, it's minus 99%. Same for nitrogen and particulate matters. So overall, this LNG is really going to change, but at the same time, it's going to take decades for the industry to change the motorization from current heavy fuel oil into LNG or other more compliant fuels. Secondly, in 4 days from now, on March 19th in Rotterdam, there will be a first test on a CMA CGM vessel with biofuels. So it's something completely new for our industry. And this is also somewhere where CMA-CGM is willing to be a pioneer and to play a role of leader in our industry. So as you can see, CMA-CGM, our industry, and in particular CMA-CGM, we are taking significant actions to decarbonize our industry. And we want to do more in this regard and to act as a leader in our industry in environment protection. We are convinced at CMA-CGM that sustainability is the challenge for the decades to come in our industry.
Thank you. As both of us are French, I will echo a debate that we have in French. All of us know that behind us we have a few months of social instability in France. And at the very beginning of that social instability, there was the implementation of a carbon tax in France for ordinary people. And one of the problems that have been put forward is the fact that for ordinary people, paying that kind of carbon tax doesn't make sense as long as, for example, ships entering in the port of Marseille do not pay that kind of tax. And considering the way you intend to take a kind of leadership as regard the transformation of the evolution of your sector, would you consider that kind of tool could be useful as long as it would be applied? And I understand that this is completely theoretical, but I'm an academic. Would you consider that it could be a useful leverage?
Well, I think with the implementation of IMO 2020, so it's not on carbon, it's on sulfur, but we could think about extending it to carbon. The cost impact for our industry of this new regulation is $60 billion. At some stage, it's obvious that we will have to pass on this cost to the end customer. We are a cost-driven industry with extremely low margins, and nobody in our industry can afford to pay this additional cost. However, where we have the leading role is to explain to our customer that this is the fair price, the sustainable price. 60 billion.
Okay, I understand that it is big money, but really, relatively to your sector, what does it represent?
Well, if you think about the consolidated results of our sector for last year, operating results was unfortunately negative, around -$6 billion US. Okay. So it's already clear. Negative in a way. So, but we are in a market that is highly competitive. And I join your academic perspective, but it's a purely supply-demand market that we are playing in. So I would say if we have more regulation, and I believe more regulation will be coming, whether it's on carbon or on SO2, definitely the cost will have to be borne by the customers, by the end customers. In terms of regulation, whether it's in France, you also have to think that when you decide for regulation in France, it's also a very competitive market, and we call many ports with the same ships, whether it's in North Europe or in Mediterranean. So that's important as well to keep in mind.
Okay, thank you. I will have later, if you have time, an additional question as regards China, but I keep it for later. I prefer giving the priority to the audience. If you have, yes, please. I'm sure you have questions as regards climate change. Or maybe you are convinced that we have already mentioned all the solutions.
Good afternoon. I'm Ron Tan from PRC Global. We are in fuel efficiency. I have two quick questions. One of the speakers from the WWF mentioned about the palm oil used as biofuel, biodiesel in Europe, which I think they have stopped by law. They're not. But in the meantime, Indonesia and Malaysia are signatory to the Paris and Poland Agreement, okay? And they are the biggest producer of palm oil. And now they are going to pass a new law in Indonesia and in Malaysia to use 20% of the cooking oil for biodiesel. So are you saying that are they going to stop deforestation? One. The other one is we've been talking about carbon tax and all that, penalizing the consumer. Why don't we turn it the other way around? We penalize the oil major who produces all these petrol, diesel, and fuel oil that causes belching emission. And the other thing is, the oil giants are very irresponsible. They do not have CSR. Why? When they sell the petrol and diesel to us, they never tell us or say that the product you are buying, you need oxygen to combust. And 2 dozen of the country are at 6,000 feet above sea level. Kathmandu, Nepal, and Rwanda. All oxygen deficit. You cannot combust petrol, diesel, or fuel oil. The result is catastrophic belching emission, and nothing in the IPCC report said that all these high altitude countries complies with the current 1.5 degrees C. How are they going to comply? How are they going to pay carbon tax? When at that level, instead of burning 1 liter of petrol or diesel, you got to burn 2 or 3 liters. And you ask them to pay carbon tax. I think it's very unfair. So you should punish Total, Shell, and ExxonMobil, all these oil producers, with their humongous profit. We claw them back and fight climate change. I thank you.
Okay, thank you. Your both questions are very clear. Jane, maybe for the first question?
Sure. I mean, that's what we call the secondary or the leakage market with palm oil, right? And Asia right now, whatever Europe doesn't want, Asia is taking in. Yes, absolutely, Indonesia and Malaysia are now stepping up their domestic consumption of unsustainable deforestation-linked palm oil, which is why with the finance sector, if the finance sector can lend its weight either to push the governments or to push in terms of not lending or investing to any part of that supply chain that doesn't have deforestation-free criteria, that's an added influence. It's not a silver bullet. You need all different parts to act, right? And your point on carbon tax, I do take that. I mean, and the whole issue about the just transition. And the oil majors, trust me, they are not getting off the hook. You have, I think, 9 states in the US suing the oil majors for their part in climate change. You have, I think it was the Philippines also doing that, and Vanuatu, if I pronounce it correctly, is also thinking of slapping on some form of a lawsuit. So litigation risk is increasing. And it's also where the governments need to think about all these externalities. So if they persist in heavy fossil fuel power generation, they will pay the price because there are no shortage of studies. I mean, S&P has said that, Moody's have said that, Oxford have multiple studies that the cost of capital is going to increase due to climate change for certain countries. And some of these countries are those who are also engaging in adding on all these assets and also in deforestation. So their ministries of finance will find it more costly to raise international capital. They themselves, right, the Ministry of Health will have a heavier burden as people are getting sicker, Ministry of Manpower when people are dying early, missing school. So when they add up all these externalities, it's back down to the pocketbook of the country. So how they then readjust their finances such that it's not the consumer that pays, but also sharing some of those longer-term savings from moving towards a low-carbon sustainable economy and helping the poor move along. You have the same problem with water, right? Where the cost of water, the price of water is here, the cost of water is here, the value of water is here. And fuel subsidies, where governments feel compelled to provide subsidies and resulting in inefficient use of these natural resources. So I think a fundamental rethink is also required and factoring in these externalities.
Thank you. Benedict, maybe on the second question, which is also tricky.
Yes, I agree with the points that you raised. That so if you look at what most economists actually say, a carbon price is actually the most economically efficient way to address climate change, because it sends a price signal through the economy. It gets people to respond to what they can do to reduce emissions. But I think one important point that you make is that a carbon price on its own, the most effective way of applying it is that it needs to be economy-wide. It needs to cover broadly all the emission sectors within the economy. It cannot be only a carbon tax or a carbon price that is only applied to a specific segment itself. The other issue which I think we want to highlight is that I think this issue of belching and all that is really key. But what we see happening in the transport sector is greater shifts towards electrification. And if you look at an electric vehicle, and you assume the electricity comes from natural gas, an electric vehicle is about, in terms of carbon efficiency, the grams per CO2, 2 times, is double the efficiency compared to an internal combustion engine. So it's a move that I think we are seeing increasingly around the world. We're also looking at how Singapore can actually move and promote greater electrification of our fleets.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, my name is Eddie Lee. I'm a volunteer for an NGO, but before that I was from shipping. I want to address this question to Matthew from CMA CGM. I've seen the world is full of contradiction. Because of economy, you want to increase the efficiency. I've seen your container shipping trade, the pace of ships on the size have grown tremendously in the last decades. So creating a lot of overcapacity. So the unit cost of, say, a shirt, of 1 TU can over 10,000 shirts, whatever. So I'm also doing recycling, whatever. I've seen so much, waste on this sort of product because I think the unit cost of transportation really is dropping too much. And I've seen a lot of ships are idle because of economically obsolete, not because of technology, because you have now 20,000 TU ships. And while those ships, 5,000 are still can trade. So you're benefiting the consumer, but on the other hand, you're creating overconsumption because of the lower transportation costs. It's a contradiction. Yeah. Thank you.
Mathieu.
Thank you. I'm not sure I got the question, but I will comment on what you just said. I don't see the contradiction. Clearly, what we are doing is to make shipping as efficient as possible. And the overconsumption, look, when you are on a trade in our business, when there is a gap between supply and demand, we put ship at anchor. This is what we do, okay? Or we deploy ships to another trade where there is more business. And this is my day-to-day job. As Professor mentioned, we are optimizing this. The first point, I take it, and I think it's a very, very valid one, about basically we reduce the cost as much as we can. But then I will give you an example. I mentioned the IMO 2020 new regulation. The cost today for us, I mentioned $2 billion. This is total per container, more interestingly related to your question, to your point. $160 per container additional. Average cost, depending obviously on the trade, but the average over cost is $160 per container. Again, this cost will have to be borne by the shippers, by the consignees, basically by the customers. So it will increase for CMA CGM, for our competitors as well, the cost of shipping a good from point A to point B in order to make it more sustainable. Okay? So the cost of shipping is not decreasing structurally. It is going to increase next year significantly by 60 billion for the whole industry. If you take the unit number, $150, $160, which is the cost, over cost for CMA CGM. So you have this difference between, it's not true to say that the cost of shipping is going down. The unit cost due to the size of ship increasing, it's true, it's going down, but the overall cost from point A to point B is not going down at all.
Thank you, Mathieu. We still have time for 2 questions, please.
Hi, thank you very much for your comments and insights on this panel. I'm Roshni Benedette, and I'm a teacher as well as a journalist. I'm asking this question in both capacities today. My question is to Mr. Chia and whomever else is comfortable to answer it on the panel. It's a Singapore-specific question, and if I could just preface it, I recently did a fellowship in the United States for Organizing for Action, which was heavily focused on environmental issues. So hence, this is why I'm on my environmental bandwagon for the past 2 days, if in case nobody noticed. So in Singapore, here we have the Carbon Pricing Bill, the Energy Conservation Act, These are all very commendable and excellent initiatives to address the issue. But at the practical grassroots level, at the functional level, Mr. Chair, there seems to be a lot lacking. If I can give you two examples to back up my comment. First, food security. Food waste in Singapore, which is a horrendous issue. There is very little access to composting in the most basic of HDB estates, which is a clear solution to the issue of food wastage. On the recycling and plastics issue, in our educational institutions, there's very little access to lemongrass straws, for instance. Some schools have it, some schools don't. There seems to be a dysfunction in terms of addressing the issue at a basic grassroots level. Your response?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. And I think you really hit the nail on the head. It's really important that when we think about climate change, it's not just government taking action top down. You need grassroots community level action to be scaled up as well. And I don't disagree with you. There are gaps. There's definitely more that we can do in terms of how we can translate awareness to action. In fact, we have done a number of climate change surveys, awareness surveys, and generally awareness has been pretty good. People are aware that climate change is an important issue. I think the key challenge is how do you translate the awareness to actually action on the ground. So last year, we designated last year as Year of Climate Action. And through the designation of Year of Climate Action, we had an online portal where people pledged that they would take action on climate change. We received a total of 300,000 pledges, which was actually above what we expected from individuals as well as from companies and corporates. So actually, the key challenge going forward is how we can translate what people are aware of, what people have pledged to actually action on the ground. You have given some pretty good examples. Some of the other things that we are doing, apart from the examples that you mentioned, is when I talked just now about positive energy buildings, we think one of the key segments which is most ripe for plucking is positive energy low-rise schools, because most schools in Singapore tend to be fairly low-rise. And if you try to maximize solar deployment on those schools, if you try to change student behavior so that they waste less food, they waste less energy, they recycle more, they reuse more, we think that's a huge segment where there's lots of potential to move towards positive energy. So we don't disagree. I don't disagree. It's a gap, but I think we are really looking for partners. And if you say you're a teacher, if your school is interested, I mean, please do reach out to us and we'll link you up with the right people. And we hope to work together to make something happen on the ground itself. Yeah.
Very last question. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Professor Euston Kwa, President of Economic Society. So thank you, panelists, for the insightful comments. I have one comment followed by two questions. And the first comment is I want to drive home the point that what Benedict has said, which is in Singapore, we are renewable energy deficient. And that means we cannot tap on the usual sources of renewable energy for Singapore. Now, second point is that being renewable energy means that we have to have minimum wastage for energy use. And so this is a very important point, and I think Singapore has done very well on energy efficiency. And for the poor countries, less developed countries, this is something also that we must thoroughly exploit with this energy efficiency. Now, I want to make a plea, which is the comment, on that many countries in Asia and less developed countries, we don't do a lot of proper cost-benefit analysis. And cost-benefit analysis or project evaluation is key to at least alleviating or mitigating or reducing some of the aspects on carbon emissions and global warming. We must have the right projects. And these poor countries be even more critical for them because they are lacking in budget and so on. So what does it mean? It means that we have to do a complete cost-benefit analysis, which includes non-market goods. Clean air, clean water, everything must be added in. That is something that's very lacking in Asian countries. Now, my question is this. How do we know that a given society really wants to be environmentally green? How do we know that? And how do we know that this is really actually what society wants. Can the panelists tell us something?
Okay, I'm afraid we have that debate in France presently, and the question is not that easy to be provided. What I understand of the French situation is that the debate is not really do we want a sustainable society, but how to share the burden and how do we face some allocation problem, and the different that question can only be answered on the basis of what is the reality of one nation. And for example, in France, the answer will not be the same than in Germany for reasons that depend on geography, on the investment that we have made in the past. But whatever, I share your question, because in fact we have a tension between all the generations that are present and the ones that are not already present, but that will have to face the consequences of climate change at the end of that century and before, in fact. And what is interesting is to observe that presently today in Europe, each Friday, and even in my university, I have some colleagues in the auditorium, or some of our students are on strike, requiring more robust and dynamic effort as to transform the society. And my intuition, it is only for the moment of an intuition, is that we will have to face that tension between generation in the future, and not only between rich and all countries and the other part of the world, and that new dimension of the transition is something which is interesting to be observed. Maybe a very last question, which is something I have in mind. I don't know. I know we don't have time to answer it. Nevertheless, I will ask it. My perception is that for the future, and if we make the link with the previous session, there will be an issue in terms of leadership, of world leadership, and more specifically of leadership of the energy transition. And something is new in the context of the Paris Agreement is the fact that if we compare the position of China during the COP21 and what was its position in Copenhagen a few years before, there is a real commitment, at least seen from Europe, and maybe this is a naive vision of a guy living in Paris. And so you live close to China, you have economic relations which are intense with China. What is your perception of the evolution of the Chinese economy towards more sustainability?
So since we are running out of time, I'll just give this a very short answer. I think there definitely has been a shift, and I think the shift has been driven by two reasons. One is a recognition that there's huge green growth opportunities. So by embracing this, you really see that addressing climate change is also developing green solutions that can be exported around the world. That's one. I mean, you have seen the Chinese manufacturers, solar manufacturers are really big. Their electric vehicle manufacturers are also gaining foothold around the world as well. So that's one. The other aspect is as countries around the world, as middle class population increases, demand for a better living environment increases as well. Demand for clean air, I think as Prof. Houston Kwame mentioned, also increases. So I think that the impetus on both fronts, what the domestic population want, a good living environment and clean air, where they think new business opportunities are around the world. Yeah.
Jen, you have to manage infrastructure both in Singapore and in Shanghai. I'm sure you have your own perception of the evolution of the Chinese situation.
Well, I would definitely confirm what Benedict just said, and we are, as CMS CGM, a strong partner with COSCO, who is the Chinese shipping company, and we are working together also as partners, as operational partners, in order to improve the efficiency of our ships, also to improve the efficiency of our network design, the way we organize our lines in order to optimize with the bigger ships coming and reduce the consumption and the overall cost for our industry.
Jen, I don't know whether you want to add something?
I mean, I would say if I look at the sustainable sourcing, and production, I would say that China is taking steps forward. We have seen that, together with WWF, they created, for example, the Chinese Sustainable Meat and Dairy Declaration, Sustainable Retail Roundtable, Sustainable Palm Oil Forum, where they are getting companies to take leadership to do sustainable procurement, because of course China is a very, very large buyer of global commodities that are linked to deforestation and, of course, climate change.
Thank you. Despite the extra time, we still have time to applaud our panelists, to thank them. And I will be happy to continue that exchange during the lunch. Thank you.